So welcome to everyone. I'm very glad to see people here from Europe and from Australia and from various other places near and far. I always say it's the only virtue for me of the current moment when we meet online is that we can connect over great distances, and it's sort of an equalizer at that level. Anyway, this is our Thursday afternoon speaker series in the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry at McGill. These occur on most Thursdays in the month, and they fall under different rubrics: culture, mind, and brain, global mental health, culture and community mental health, and culture and clinic. And our talk today is relevant to many of these rubrics, but especially to the culture, mind, and brain framework, as you'll hear, I think. And the usual format is that we have about an hour presentation, about an hour for discussion. So then it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Kathryn Tabb, who is at the Department of Philosophy of Bard College. And she is, among other things, a philosopher of psychiatry and has looked at a number of important issues in contemporary psychiatry and its connection to the history of how psychiatry has constructed its objects of concern. And we're very pleased today to be able to welcome her and to learn from her about some of her reflections and critical thinking about the sort of emergence of what has been branded precision psychiatry. So without any further ado, I just welcome Kathryn and give the floor to you.
Thank you all so much for having me and for coming from all over the place. It's very nice to see some familiar faces. So yeah, we have a really nice, generous amount of time. I think this talk is about 45 minutes. I might slow down a bit since we have a bit more, but please do stop me if there are questions of clarification or anything as we go along. All right. Share my slides. So this is an overview for my plan. I know we have a mixed audience here, so much of what I say might be familiar to some of you. Maybe different parts will be familiar to different sorts of folks. But I will start by going over both what I mean by precision medicine and what I mean by precision psychiatry, and talk a little bit about the history of how we got here to precision psychiatry being what I consider a new paradigm for psychiatry. I'm going to look particularly at three projects that I think are definitional of precision psychiatry: changes in how we think about taxonomy, the use of big data, and an emphasis on reduction. And I'll show how each of those is at play in recent shifts in how psychiatry is researched. And I should say I'm really focusing on research here. I'm focusing on biomedical research, some on translational research. The implications for the clinic will come in towards the end of the talk. I'm going to then make two cases against precision psychiatry. I should say at the outset, my feelings about precision psychiatry are not straightforward. So I have a paper from 2015 in which I advocate for some of the conceptual shifts that here I am critiquing. So I'm happy to sort that out with you all in the Q&A. But today I'm going to make two critical cases. One is an epistemic case and one is an ethical case. And then we'll talk about it. All right, so starting now with some background, and this is where I think this might be quite familiar to folks who use this manual on a daily basis. The DSM, there were kind of earlier precursors, but the first edition, official edition was in 1952. And this manual is characterized, maybe I'll just grab it and show it to people. I just feel like the visual on this is so amazing if you haven't seen them. So this is one. This came out in 1952 and is really characterized by psychoanalytic frameworks. And it was really the result of a desire after World War II to have better statistics on the number of soldiers coming back with PTSD and other conditions. So it grew out of really statistical efforts early on. That statistical in the title was really significant. By the time we get to 3, we are getting close to this girth. This is the 5. But there was a real jump in size between 1952 and 1980. And there was also a really profound shift in the sort of criteria that were used to determine psychiatric categories and to diagnose people into those categories. In philosophy, we talk about this turn as an operationalist turn, by which we mean that the criteria for diagnosis were things that could be operationalized in the clinic. So that means something that someone can observe and see. And there's a very interesting background here on the philosophical side of a general shift towards operationalism and away from the sorts of assumed fundamental causes and explanations that couldn't be proved or couldn't be shown empirically, generally within philosophical thinking. There's a very interesting episode where a very prominent philosopher of science, Hempel, came and lectured what then became the American Psychological Association, but was then, I believe, called the American Psychopathological Association, and introduced this language of operationalism. There's a lot of debate about how influential that actually was, if anyone actually listened, but the timing is very, very suggestive and interesting. So in the DSM-3, much of that psychoanalytic language, some people think all of it, was really purged, and there was this turn towards signs and symptoms that can be clearly observed in the clinic. The DSM-4 in 1994 kept on with that general methodological and conceptual set of commitments. More empirical data was introduced. The big shift came with the DSM-5, which after many trials and travails finally came out in 2014. There's a shift to the away from the Roman numerals into the Arabic numerals, which I think were in part intended to represent this real shift in the conceptual undergirdings of the manual. So there was a real enthusiasm at the beginning of that revision process for etiological explanation, that is causal explanation of mechanisms. There were all sorts of new work groups put together in the hopes of integrating progress in biomedical research into the clinical categories. And the consensus of most people is that that effort was largely unsuccessful, that most of the categories stayed fairly operational. Much of the etiological research that people were excited about ended up in appendices because it was determined to just not be applicable, not ready for translation to the clinic. Okay, but what I want to highlight, besides that kind of shifting in priorities, which will become very important for us later on, is also just how much work this book has been asked to do over the course of its existence. So this is from the introduction to the DSM-4R from 2000. The quote here: "Our highest priority has been to provide a helpful guide to clinical practice. We hope to make DSM-4 practical and useful for clinicians by striving for brevity of criteria sets, clarity of language, and explicit statements of the constructs embodied in diagnostic criteria. An additional goal was to facilitate research and improve communication among clinicians and researchers. We were also mindful of the use of the DSM-4 for improving the collection of clinical information and as an educational tool for teaching psychopathology." So I think when we think about the move from like this to this, like from that girth to that girth, much of what was going on was that the DSM stopped being simply for clinical use or for statistical use, which was more doable with something of this size. But once you were trying to incorporate all the categories that were being used also by biomedical researchers, the need really expanded for more and more and more content. So you have this one book that is the main textbook for psychiatric students. It's the diagnostic manual being used not just by psychiatric clinicians, but also by general practitioners, also by social workers, also in educational settings, also in forensic settings, and also being used in the context of discovery, which is what I'll be talking about today. So just a little statistic to kind of bring home the role of the DSM in biomedical research. And this is a bit of an old factoid from 2012 that I got from Bruce Cuthbert, but he just kind of did this informally and found that over 90% of articles in the top 3 psychiatric research journals, so that's the American Journal of Psychiatry, Biological Psychiatry, and JAMA, examined a single DSM disorder, comparing patients diagnosed with the condition to healthy controls. So basically the paradigm of psychiatric research, certainly by the end of the 20th century, was to have 2 groups, a control group and an experimental group, and the experimental group would be those meeting criteria for a DSM condition compared with a control. And of course, there are more complex study designs comparing two different diagnoses. But basically, research was done through the lens of the DSM. So this has meant that philosophers of psychiatry have just spent an astonishing amount of time and energy trying to figure out what these diagnostic categories are. We use the language of natural kinds to think about this a lot, and it's not too relevant here, but all we mean by natural kinds is a category that exists in nature rather than being a social construction. So we think about gold as a paradigmatic natural kind. It has very well behaved certain number of protons in your nucleus. You're going to have a gold atom. It's going to behave in certain ways. And so the consensus among philosophers of psychiatry has been that psychiatric disorders are not natural in this way, that there is something constructed about them. And it's kind of gone on, kinds of kinds, what kinds of things are psychiatric disorders? What is a mental disorder? And I want to highlight that I think this has been sort of a fight without much of an adversary. Like, no one really thinks that psychiatric disorders are natural the way that something like gold is natural. The architects of the DSM are themselves very clear that they think the categories are constructions. This doesn't, of course, mean that they don't refer to anything real, but they think that the boundaries of the categories are things that we have built together on the basis of what shows up in the clinic and what works best for practice and that kind of thing. So it's hard to find anyone who's kind of like a hard naturalist about psychiatric categories, even among people who think that disease is very real and that disease categories are very real. Many people will still acknowledge that there's something kind of constructed about our psychiatric categories. And for a long time, I think this was more or less seen as fine by psychiatrists, but there, with exceptions that we could talk about, but there arose towards the end of the 20th century and into the early 21st, a real anxiety, not about whether psychiatric disorders are real or constructed. So that was kind of like in the 1970s with the anti-psychiatry movement. There were these kinds of worries about whether psychiatric disorders are actually medical at all. That's not the kind of thing we're talking about today. I'm interested in psychiatrists who became concerned that whether they're constructed or whether they're real, they're doing a real disservice to psychiatric discovery. So here's a couple of examples. Ben Leahy is a psychologist, and on a grant application in 2013, he wrote, "Categorical mental disorders do not line up one-to-one with variations in the functioning of neural circuits. Rather, neural circuits align with narrower neurobehavioral constructs that are themselves related to psychopathology in a cross-cutting fashion. Dysfunction in each construct is related to multiple forms of psychopathology, and most forms of psychopathology are related to dysfunction in more than one construct." So his observation here is that when you're looking at the level of the neural circuit and you're looking at popular theories, including the kind of thing he wanted to research, there are categorical distinctions that we might draw on the basis of difference, but those are not going to line up with the traditional categories of the DSM. In other words, the categories of the DSM are going to be cross-cut by the findings in the clinic. Various people got more worried about this, not only because it showed a kind of disjunct between the clinical picture and what was going on the research side, but also because of that statistic we talked about earlier, that it was widely accepted that the best research proposals would use the DSM to frame their research. So Steve Hyman, who was directing the NIMH at the beginning of the 21st century, right about the turn, got concerned that this was really putting what he called an epistemic bottleneck on psychiatric research. So he says here, given the status of the DSM-4 criteria as the community consensus, the FDA held that it could not, by itself, recognize the cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia as an indication for the development and approval of new treatments. So this is an example of the epistemic bottleneck he's talking about. In this case, the symptom of negative cognitive effects in people with schizophrenia is not listed in the diagnostic criteria for the DSM. I think it's in an appendix. Because of that, the FDA wasn't approving any research into those symptoms or into treatment for those symptoms because it wasn't seen as part of schizophrenia. Now, people who work with people with schizophrenia all agreed that this was very pertinent to the phenomena that they were treating. But the way the DSM category was set up was ruling out that sort of research. And so this idea that, that the DSM started acting as an epistemic prison really started taking off around 2000 to 2010. So here's another quote from Hyman, and Hyman's very useful for me because he was trained, he did his master's and MPhil at Cambridge in history and philosophy of science. So he uses kind of philosophical language. So we can see that language of natural kind come back in his work. But here's a quote where he says, "The DSM system was a critical platform for research that made possible shared understandings of disease models or affected populations under study. At the same time, it created an unintended epistemic prison that was palpably impeding scientific progress. Outside of their ongoing research projects, most investigators understood that the DSM-4 was heuristic, pending the advance of science. In practice, however, the DSM-4 diagnoses controlled the research questions they could ask and perhaps even imagine." The title of this paper by Hyman is "The Reification of Psychiatric Categories." That is the thingification, making something into a thing. And what concerned him was that the DSM categories were being seen as entities that should be the subject of scientific research, when actually they were not. They were social constructions, they were not natural kinds. But more than that, the social constructions were not even constructed in a way that was conducive to scientific research. They were constructed in a way that was conducive to good clinical work, but not good research work. Okay, Thomas Insel takes over from Hyman as the director of the NIMH, and he very explicitly and vocally builds on Hyman's critique of psychiatry. This is a paper from 2005 entitled "Psychiatry is a Clinical Neuroscience Discipline." And this was really Hyman's vision, or sorry, Insel's vision, that psychiatry needed to be completely reframed as a branch of neuroscience that had been translated into the clinic. So instead of starting with phenomenology, with psychopathology, and then trying to find scientific insights on the basis of that picture, you go the other direction. You treat psychiatry as a part of neuroscience. So this led Insel to introduce something called the Research Domain Criteria Matrix or project that probably many of you are familiar with at this point. For those who aren't, what it's really important to understand about RDoC is that it is not a tool for diagnosing patients. So it is not an alternative to the DSM. It does not diagnose patients. What it was really a tool to diagnose research proposals or to allow people applying to the NIMH for grants to avoid that trap of having to use the DSM to characterize their research projects. As I say in this last bullet point, RDoC changes the targets of validation from diagnoses to any sort of phenomenon relevant to psychopathology that may be viewed either as an extreme on a spectrum of human variation or as a dysfunctional structure or process. So what does that mean? This is a very small part of the matrix. The matrix is very, very big and lives online. So you can go to it and play and click all of these little boxes. Basically what we have is in the rows, we have different what are called domains and constructs. So here cognitive systems is the domain, and constructs include things like attention, perception, cognitive control. And these are borrowed from cognitive science and from neuroscience. In the columns, you have units of analysis. These range from genes up to self-report. The paradigms column is doing something different that we could talk about if people are interested. You'll notice, this is from a while ago, this screenshot of the matrix, and you'll notice that the circuits column is completely filled in. All of those cells are occupied. That is because, as Insel really was quite frank about, he thought that circuits were the most important. So there was a lot of interesting buzz when RDoC first came out about the behavior and self-report columns. And when people expressed, and I'll talk about this later, a huge amount of anxiety about this idea of psychiatry as clinical neuroscience. It felt very excluding for everyone who wasn't a neuroscientist, basically. Even those psychiatric geneticists who were very comfortable with reductionistic approaches, but were worried that they would lose funding. A representative of RDoC when I asked about this, said that they were fine with people bringing in the other columns. In fact, they encouraged it, but they always wanted it to be comparative with the circuits column. So something that didn't reference the level of the circuit at all was less likely to be funded. So what you get here is when you click on one of these cells, you can kind of zoom in, and it will give you a set of links of studies that have been done, funded through the NIMH on that particular point. You can then click on any of the contents, and then ultimately you can get links to papers. So it's basically, the RDoC is, the idea is that it acts as a massive, massive database, not only as a way for people to conceive of and present their research proposals, but also after the research has been done, to make it available in an integrated way. Okay, here's where I got interested. Since Instell's strategic plan was implemented, the NIMH's spending on basic science has gone up by 28%, while the budget for research into epidemiology, treatment, and health services has gone down by 16.7%, bringing the overall budget to around a 50-50 split between basic science research and clinical and translational research. So there's a real change in the way that money was spent by the NIMH. The feeling that people were having, especially epidemiologists, people doing translational research looking at drug regimens, that their stuff wasn't getting funded, was right. It was right. It wasn't entirely right. I mean, certainly plenty of clinical and translational work was still funded, but the numbers had shifted very dramatically. Now, this is in line with a broader shift in spending priorities that came about because of the movement towards precision medicine more broadly. So I'm going to kind of try quickly to just give an overview of precision medicine itself. Anyone joining us from Europe or I think probably most of the world beside the States might be more familiar with the language of personalized medicine. In the States, the language of personalization was replaced very self-consciously by the language of precision for reasons that are interesting as well, but will take us too far afield. And the basic idea here is that precision medicine's kind of like the simplest way it's discussed ensures that the right treatment is delivered to the right patient at the right time. So the basic picture is, and we all know this who work in psychiatry, that many of our interventions will have a really differential result on our patients. So sometimes we'll see a benefit, sometimes we won't see a benefit, sometimes we'll see some side effects, sometimes we'll see others, and frequently we end up using a trial and error technique to try to match patients to the right medicine. The idea with precision medicine is you can use a biomarker like a bit of DNA or a blood product to tailor your therapy to the particular patient on the basis of the biomarker, and that way you limit misfires. So in 2015, President Obama kicked off the Precision Medicine Initiative, which has funded a range of things, but one of them is a 1 million-person representative cohort of Americans whose biomarkers at various levels are being gathered. I just want to note this language of precision. I think it's very interesting that America led the way in introducing it. It wasn't the only context in which we got very interested in precision. So also at the turn of the 21st century, precision warfare was very much in vogue. So you see President Bush II here. We've applied the new powers of technology to strike an enemy force with speed and incredible precision. By a combination of creative strategies and advanced technologies, we are redefining war on our terms. In this new era of warfare, we can target a regime and not a nation. So it's really a similar picture that you kind of get in, you get out, you feel a few casualties, few misfires. Okay. So I want to talk about what precision medicine is in terms of these 3 categories I mentioned earlier. The first is taxonomy. This is one of the most famous success stories of precision medicine that you may know about, which is the anti-cancer drug Herceptin. So if you have a tumor that is overexpressing a particular gene, and it need not, this is what is crucial for our point, it need not be located anywhere particular in the body. it will respond to Herceptin in a way that really is kind of unprecedented. Like it's really been a miracle drug for a lot of people. The effect of this is that we now have a category of drugs that respond to this agent. A category of cancers. And those cancers are located anywhere in the body. So they might be in the breast, they might be in the pancreas. And so the taxonomy of oncology had to shift to accommodate this kind of change. And that's been a real hope, as we'll see for psychiatry, that there will be a shift in the way we think about what these categories are, but also how they stand in relationship to each other on the basis of drug response. So the second main criteria for me for something counting as precision medicine is an engagement with big data. The reason you need big data is the same reason we want high power in all of our studies, right? Just more subjects gives us better data. So traditionally, studies were small enough to kind of meet criteria using basic statistics. There's been a turn to wanting bigger and bigger and bigger data sets because we're looking for more and more and more obscure sources of difference. So I mentioned earlier this 1 million person cohort. This was called the All of Us initiative. And when I worked at Columbia, it was very interesting watching my colleagues who were in charge of gathering patients for the All of Us cohort. Columbia is located in Harlem. And so the hope was that the Columbia cohort would be racially diverse and thus help contribute to the representative nature of the entire cohort. So there were a lot of ideas about how you sell a population that has historically been oppressed by the medical industrial complex on this sort of participation. The way that it was determined was most effective was to tell people that it would benefit them personally. So a lot of the literature you see recruiting people for precision medicine studies will emphasize that it will help you think about your lifestyle, that it will give you information about your particular risk factors. Precision medicine is a long way off from this. So sociologists, philosophers, historians of medicine have become increasingly concerned, especially around the racialized language that's been used in recruitment. Jim Tabery is just finishing up a really wonderful book on that subject and on the history of precision medicine in this context. So this is a story from the New Yorker about David Goldstein's work at Columbia. He's a population geneticist. And this is the kind of success story people often bring up when we talk about precision medicine. So this is a little boy, Bertrand, who was discovered using one of these truly massive data sets to have a very particular genetic anomaly that was explaining his very severe disease. And when that genetic anomaly was found, it was pretty straightforward to reverse engineer a treatment for him that was transformative. So this idea that big data will get us to these very particular understandings of individuals has been the big selling point for precision medicine for the public. So anyone who went to medical school, maybe a while ago, I don't know if this is still taught in medical school, but this truism about how if you hear hoofbeats, you're not to think that a zebra is behind you, you're to think a horse is behind you. This is also very Northern Hemisphere centric. If you went to medical school in Johannesburg, this would not probably be that helpful, but the idea is that you want to always think about the common thing because that's the more likely thing, right? So probably it's asthma, not some obscure lung disease. The precision medicine rhetoric is trying to invert this. So they're saying we're all zebras, right? We're not just zebras, we're rainbow zebras. We're all very special. And we need this very particular information about ourselves to really have a sense of what is going on. So this Siren Interactive is a direct-to-consumer precision medicine company that is trying to gather data. Okay. So the third thing I want to talk about is reduction. And reduction is a technical term in philosophy of science, but it really means what it sounds like, just to look at something at a lower level of analysis. Precision medicine has embraced what's been called the omics scale. So omics meaning all these different levels of analysis, the genome, the epigenome, the transcriptome, all the way up or down, depending on how you want to think about it, to the microbiome. So the idea is that each of us is made up of these variety of systems that all engage with each other, and each of which can be identified, each of which has data that can be collected that will allow us to be classified in different ways into what's been called a personal omics profile. Okay, so putting all these things together, I think the traditional picture of biomedical discovery has gone something like this. You start with taxonomy. You then use data, big data, small data, whatever, to refine that taxonomy. And what I mean by refine is to really reduce it to mechanisms to figure out what's going on. But you start with a clinical picture. Precision medicine wants to flip the script on that. So instead, you start with big data, like that All of Us recruitment effort, that 1 million person data set. The aim of it is not to look for necessarily anything in particular. It's to supply a massive amount of data so you can see what pops out when you start using very advanced statistical tools on it. And of course, various researchers will approach it and use it for their own purposes. But the data itself has a kind of neutrality. What it's really giving us is its size and its scope. And then researchers will come in, they will use it to discover different strata of that population. They will identify mechanisms that explain those differences, and that can be used to found a new taxonomy, as we saw happened in the case of oncology with the discovery of Herceptin. Okay, I am now going to talk about how each of these projects operate in psychiatry, and then I'll turn to my critical arguments. So first of all, thinking about taxonomy, the obvious thing, of course, is that Hyman introduced the RDoC criteria as a different way for researchers to think about their studies and to avoid using the DSM. And I should say for those, I think many of you are probably very aware of this at the time, but this was very dramatic. Like Incel was writing blog posts basically being like the DSM is over, and the editors of the DSM were firing back. And like it was really like a very conscious, tense time for psychiatry. And I just want to note here in this commentary, and Incel was really pumping these out, that he's equating the RDoC with precision medicine very explicitly. This is a overview of RDoC's aims that was released in 2012 by Sarah Morris and Bruce Cuthbert. I just want to show you how I think these projects are kind of just very much embedded in RDoC itself. So they say first, mental illnesses are presumed to be disorders of brain circuits. So there we have our reduction. What is a mental illness? It can be reduced down and understood at the level of neuroscience. Secondly, it is assumed that the tools of clinical neuroscience, including functional neuroimaging, electrophysiology, and new methods for measuring neural connections, can be used to identify dysfunction in neural circuits. So there's our big data. Third, the RDoC approach presumes that data from genetics research and clinical neuroscience will yield biosignatures that will augment clinical signs and symptoms for the purposes of clinical intervention and management. So that's why I see the hope for this taxonomic revision to lurk. So the question I have is whether this kind of flipping of the script that has been celebrated in precision medicine and other fields like oncology, and I should say I talk a lot about oncology. I just finished a paper comparing how precision works in oncology and in psychiatry, so it's kind of on my mind. It is where most of the successes have been located, but also immunology has been a big area for precision medicine where there's been some really, really exciting transformative work. And there are other fields as well. But the question here is really whether this new structuring of the process of discovery will work for psychiatry, starting with big data, using that to find reductive explanations, and then moving on to a new taxonomy. I want to argue now that it won't. For the reason that all of these three projects operate quite differently in psychiatry than they do in other fields. So this is a wonderful diagram from a meta-analysis that Ken Kendler did with colleagues in 2006 of major depressive episodes in men. And it's a dizzying, but also kind of beautiful diagram. And the details don't really matter for us, but can people see my mouse moving? Yeah, cool, okay. So these different colors are different generation or different decades, periods, eras of life. So green is childhood, early adolescence, late adolescence, adulthood, within the last year. And what the authors did is they calculated the likelihood of any given factor as leading to other factors at the next stage of development, and all of these adding up to the probabilities for an episode of major depression within the last year. And what I love about this diagram is it just shows the incredible complication that goes into calculating someone's risk for psychiatric disorder. So we have genetic risk up here, and then experiential factors like low parental warmth. And then we have personality characteristics like neuroticism or low self-esteem. We have things impacted by SES, like low education, low social support. We have what we may think of as contingencies of life, or as the result of all those other things, risk of divorce, marital problems, but also things that are completely outside of one's control, like national disasters, financial problems, employment problems, etc. So all of these different factors weave and tangle together to give us explanations in psychiatry. And of course, this is not unique to psychiatry. Certainly when we talk about something like cancer, it's also crucial to think about all these different levels of analysis. But psychiatry, I think, is at an extreme in involving all these very, very disparate types of causation. So when you think about the kind of data you need to gather to approach a chart like this, it's just enormous. I mean, it's just huge. Like, this was a massive undertaking to make this. Okay, thinking about reduction, and this is kind of the biggest one for me. I think that there is reason to worry about having successful reduction in psychiatry. And this is maybe where some of you would disagree the most strongly. I think in terms of genetics, the consensus has really grown that at least what we're looking for is not genes of large effect, right? So someone like Ken Kendler, who's a leading psychiatric geneticist, is very committed to the view that we are not going to find one or a few genes that can explain our major categories like schizophrenia. That's just like the field has moved on. Using genome-wide association studies, so techniques that look for genes of small effect, lots of genes of small effect, we've made some progress, but genes that have been found that have been implicated in psychopathology tend to be a very, very small effect. We don't have any picture of any combination of genes or particular genetic profile that allows us to predict much better than looking at something like family history. And we also, if we want genes to then play this kind of bridging role of informing us about mechanisms that cause psychiatry, that has also been a place where there's been progress, but progress has been really slow. So there's a study a few years ago that was very exciting about the complement-4 gene and the role it seems to play in schizophrenia. But we're talking about an effect of like you're 1.5% more likely to have schizophrenia if you have that particular genetic profile. Right? These are very, very small effects. So I have a picture of my LM1 down here, and I should update his unit. Yeah, he's at Bordeaux now because we've been working on this project together about what psychiatric biomarkers are. And I'm happy to share that paper if this part of things is interesting to people. Intel, of course, was arguing that it wasn't at the level of the gene, but rather at the level of the circuit that we would find robust biomarkers. And one thing that Maëlle and I have been arguing is that RDoC-funded projects focus on discovering the neural circuitry underlying domains implicated in psychopathology, not correlating biomarkers at this level with therapeutic targets in order to develop new treatment protocols. And we made this picture, which I hope is not more confusing. Oh, yeah, here it is. to explain what we mean here. So on the left, you have the kind of standard picture of precision medicine, where you start with the discovery of a direct biomarker. So in the case of Herceptin, that's people overexpressing a HER2 gene such that it leads to having a certain kind of tumor. That allows you to develop specific treatments. And then you can use those two things, the discovered biomarker and the new treatment, to have a new classificatory system on the basis of what Maëlle and I call theranostic biomarkers, by which we simply mean biomarkers that are useful for therapy. So that's the picture, the ideal picture. What we see in psychiatry via RDoC is that you start out ideally by identifying mechanisms. That's what RDoC is supposed to do, according to the NIMH. Let's stop trying to look for the underlying essences of DSM categories. Let's instead look for mechanisms at all these different levels that can explain psychopathological phenomena. This leads you to what philosophers of science have called direct localization, that is the identification of the location of the causes of the phenomenon you're interested in. Right? So we could imagine for a category like schizophrenia, realizing that as was once there was great optimism about, that there would be some kind of neurotransmitter imbalance and problem with the reuptake, and that mechanism would explain what was going on in schizophrenia. That is an example of one that has ended sadly. And indeed, none have ended very well. So psychiatry doesn't have clear cases of finding direct localization in the way that other medical fields do. So getting up to this third step, the discovery of direct biomarkers, that is, things you could test for in the clinic that would alert you to the presence or absence of a mechanism that would cause psychiatric disorder, is still a long way off. So as you can see, this kind of top step here, which we haven't really arrived at for psychiatry, is only the bottom step for precision medicine. So this is why I think it's really not that psychiatry is particularly bad at precision medicine. It's that psychiatry isn't ready for precision medicine. This just isn't a paradigm that is going to be useful until it's made much more progress in directly localizing causal mechanisms. Okay, so Incel certainly seemed to know this. This is a quote from 2014. That is RDoC, and this whole kind of shift, this paradigm shift, begins with the humble realization that we do not know enough to develop a precision medicine approach to mental disorders. We need a decade of intense scientific work, from molecular factors to social determinants, to understand normal and abnormal behavior based on a deep understanding of mechanisms. And this is really what RDoC set out to do. It set out to discover these mechanisms so that we could get to the bottom of that one staircase, go up the stairs, and then get to the bottom of the other staircase and go up the stairs. Okay, thinking about taxonomy, I'm not going to spend too much time with this, but just to say that taxonomy in psychiatry is also a huge mess, because we have these different levels of analysis. As we saw in that earlier quote, they often don't cross-cut each other at all, and different people need to use different ones. So just, most straightforwardly, someone working in a clinic that specializes in psychosis will have a much more fine-grained taxonomy of types of psychosis than a general practitioner. A general practitioner will think very differently about psychosis than someone studying it in the lab. I'm going to skip over some of this. I want to read you this quote, though. This is from Cuthbert and Kozak in 2013. Although RDoC is labeled as an experimental classification approach, it is actually not a classification system in the formal sense. It might be better termed an experiment towards classification. Notably, RDoC does not have any a priori specifications for defining disorders. That is, it does not involve criteria by which any given individual will be given a diagnosis. The omission is intentional. Another of the steps called for by AIM 1.4 is to develop reliable and valid measures of these fundamental components for use in basic studies and in more clinical settings. Development of appropriate measurement is obviously necessary for a quantitatively based system to be instantiated in the future. So again, I think RDoC very much acknowledges this problem for psychiatry with taxonomy, which is that many different people need taxonomic systems. Those taxonomic systems might cross-cut each other. It's all a bit of a mess. And that makes sense for young science, which is, I think, very much how NIMH folks are envisioning psychiatry. But I want to highlight one other worry we might have about taxonomy. In Sun Cuthbert in 2012, the idea is to start by specifying basic dimensions of functioning and their implementing brain circuits that have been identified by the last several decades of research in brain and behavior. Then in this light, mental disorders are considered extremes at one or both tails of these normal distributions. Okay, so what are they saying? They're saying what we want to do is discover the mechanisms. We want to discover variation and how the mechanisms can work. And at this point, they've cut out the DSM, right? So they don't have recourse to anything that will tell them which of these variations are normal and which of these variations are pathological. The only guide that we have had to that traditionally has been the DSM, and the DSM is out the door. So what do? Their suggestion is you look at a bell curve and you think about these two extremes, and you say that psychopathology is going to lie at the low extreme and at the high extreme. This is a very bad way to think about the normal and the pathological. This is like, I teach this in week 1 of my philosophy of medicine course, right? Pregnancy, I'm currently in my 3rd trimester. I can tell you it feels like an illness a lot of the time. My mortality is also unfortunately compromised, though a lot less than if I was in many other parts of the world. How do I know pregnancy isn't a disease? If I'm looking at any kind of bell curve type range of normal variation for various things right now, I definitely have a disease, right? And maybe we want to say pregnancy is a disease. Maybe there's advantages there in terms of thinking about it as something we should treat, but we don't typically. The IQ curve, I think I probably don't need to tell anyone here about the various ways that has been deeply problematic. Tooth plaque, everyone has it, right? Yet it is a disease. We want to, I don't know if it's a disease, but it's certainly something we want to treat, right? We want to do something about it. So if you have normal amounts of tooth plaque, you still have to go to the dentist. So this idea is just a really primitive approach to thinking about differentiating the normal and the pathological. I'm not the only person to notice this. Jerry Wakefield has written about this, and he says DSM-ICD provides the only thoughtful guidance to what conditions the RDoC must explain in terms of malfunctioning circuits. If you get rid of the DSM, and as those of you who are clinicians know, there's like always great enthusiasm for getting rid of the DSM for all kinds of very good reasons, but you are left without an account of the normal and the pathological. Okay. To conclude this little section, really what I want to say about this is that the problem the NIMH diagnosed is one of taxonomy, right? The NIMH started out, Steve Hyman started out by saying we have a taxonomic problem where the DSM is not capturing categories that will facilitate discovery. Reduction in big data, on the other hand, are answers to very different problems. So I think one thing to note is that when psychiatry embraces precision, it's embracing reduction and it's embracing big data to solve a problem that was really different, that was really about taxonomy. And changing taxonomy is absolutely part of what precision medicine does, but it's an end result of precision medicine. It's not what you do at the beginning. There are other ways in which we could change taxonomic revision. So there's a bunch of efforts underway right now. One is thinking about symptom networks. So Borsbaum's group has been very influential lately, thinking that maybe what major depression is not any underlying essence at the level of the neural circuit. Maybe it's complicated relationships between sets of symptoms, like insomnia, like suicidality, et cetera. And that you can map it all out at one level of analysis, which is the symptom, and have an explanation of what major depression is. Those are an example of some of their networks. HiTOP, some of you may know about, is a new movement towards a new classification system for research. So it's an alternative to RDoC, which is being driven by mostly personality researchers, so psychologists. Very, very interesting. We could talk about it more in the Q&A, but it also is non-reductive. It's looking at symptoms and looking at traditional categories drawn not from cognitive science or from neuroscience, but rather from psychology and psychopathology. So I think there are ways, all this to say, I think there are ways to think about changing taxonomy without embracing these other two components of precision. Okay, and then finally and quickly, I want to lay out an ethical case against precision psychiatry. And I lay it out in part to address a criticism that may have been occurring to you while I was talking, which is, sure, psychiatry isn't precise yet. So this is some feedback I commonly get when I share this work, especially with neuroscientists, where they'll say something like, we just got started. It's Luddite-ish and anti-scientific to want to cut off a research program that isn't showing success, because that's just not how science progresses. I think that's true. That's not how science progresses. But it is the fact that there has been this real shift in spending priorities. What this means is that to consider psychiatry as clinical neuroscience comes at a cost right now for other forms of research and discovery about psychiatry, into things like social determinants of health, but also into things like how drugs work, right? Basic translational stuff. So I think the way that that objection would have to be put is to say, it's worth the cost, right? You have to acknowledge that it's costing us now. And the argument has to be, it's worth the cost because later it'll pay off. Our understanding of psychiatric disorders will be transformed, and that will be so transformative for our capacity to care for patients that it is simply worth sacrificing other kinds of research that may have more immediate payoffs right now. This is a chart from a paper that, it's actually the paper I cited earlier that Insel published with Remy Caron in 2015. And what you see here, I think, is their vision of that trade-off. So they're writing in 2015, and they're arguing that the previous decade has been one they call the decade of discovery, where there's been a real improvement in thinking about pathophysiology, such that whereas in the early years of the 20th century, diagnosis was by treatment, basically, so this is what the philosopher of medicine, Jennifer Radin, calls drug cartography. You're kind of put into the location on the basis of your drug response, and then you kind of live there, and that's your diagnostic category. And they argued that over those 10 years, there had been real improvement in thinking about pathophysiology, such that we're moving into a period in 2015 of biodiagnostics where we're treating core pathologies, right? And then the vision is that in the next decade, there will be kind of increasing momentum from this up through the decade of translation, where we will move into personalized care, such that by 2025, we'd be looking at a very different picture of medicine, where prevention and cures was happening on the basis of all of these things that we've kind of moved up. The y-axis here is very confusing, but I think we're supposed to be like progressing through using all these technologies such that we can embrace molecular diagnostics, neuroimaging, et cetera. So I think this vision has failed. It was wildly optimistic, and we've come far short. So one can certainly argue that it is simply the x-axis here that is problematic, and that if you replace these dates and maybe you put 2015 like back down here, and then you put 225 like, I don't know, here, then maybe by like 2070 or something we get up here and we're actually living in a world of precision medicine. I think, you know, we can't rule that out at all. That's an empirical question, and I'm not an empiricist. What I can say conceptually is that I think committing to the uncertainty of this timeline is ethically very, very fraught. This optimism is all over precision medicine. So this is a similar chart in a textbook on genetics talking about precision medicine. So here we have the Human Genome Project, which wrapped up around 2003. We then have, again, this picture that there's going to be this kind of blaze of knowledge, such that by the time you get to 2022, you've moved up understanding the structure of genomes, understanding the biology of genomes, understanding the biology of disease, advancing the science of medicine, and improving effectiveness in healthcare. I think it is no longer appropriate to say that the Human Genome Project has reaped no rewards no practical rewards, which is something that was said a lot during the early years of the 20th century. But certainly this kind of optimism is just really, I think, been defeated. And the fact is we're in a total crisis right now. So these are just stats that I think many of you will know about kind of where we're at. And this is for my tragic country. So you guys maybe have a more optimistic picture, but nearly 60% of adults with a mental illness didn't receive mental health services in the previous year. Nearly 50% of youth aged 8 to 15 didn't receive mental health services in the previous year. Once you break that down by race, the picture just gets really horrific, more horrific. 26% of homeless adults staying in shelters have serious mental illnesses, right? So we could do this, of course, ad nauseum. And I think the pressing nature of that crisis makes it very irresponsible for people to not think very hard about what a realistic timeline is for precision medicine's goals, and exactly also what those goals would really be for psychiatry. Like, what are we really looking at? Are we looking at transformation of the zebra cases? Or are we looking at precision medicine giving rise to new treatments for something like depression or ADHD that actually contribute to the bulk of the global burden of mental illness? This is also a point that has been noticed by lots of people outside of the NIMH and outside of neuroscience. So this is from Ron Baer, who's a sociologist, public health expert at Columbia, and Galea 2015. Research undertaken in the name of precision medicine may well open new vistas of science, and precision medicine itself may ultimately make critical contributions to a narrow set of conditions that are primarily genetically determined. But the challenge we face to improve population health does not involve the frontiers of science and molecular biology. It entails development of the vision and willingness to address certain persistent social realities, and it requires an unstinting focus on the factors that matter most to the production of population health. Within the DSM establishment, this case has also been made. So Alan Francis, who's been a vocal critic of the DSM ever since he stopped being its editor-in-chief for the DSM-4. It was just a tweet from a while ago. Only one of top 10 research questions on bipolar disorder would have a shot at NIMH funding. Obsessed by cause, NIMH neglects care. Very recently, in the past couple of weeks, as some of you know, I seem to have gotten an unlikely new ally, Thomas Insel himself, who has just released this book called Healing, Our Path from Mental Illness to Mental Health, which I need to read, but I confess that I was so angry at the first paragraph of this book that I couldn't get any farther yet. So I can't say much about it, but let me just read you this first paragraph. I've wrestled with mental illness as a parent, a scientist, and a doctor for nearly half a century. Trained as a psychiatrist and working as a neuroscientist, I've spent the last 4 decades witnessing research breakthroughs on how the brain works in both health and disease. Ultimately, I became, for more than a decade, the nation's psychiatrist, director of the NIMH, overseeing more than $20 billion for mental health care research. I helped President George W. Bush respond to school shootings and co-led President Barack Obama's Brain Initiative. I advised blah, blah, blah. In short, it was my job to make a difference for Americans with mental illness. I should have been able to help us bend the curves for death and disability, but I didn't, because I misunderstood the problem. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that the problem I was solving by supporting brilliant scientists and dedicated clinicians was not the problem that faced nearly 15 million Americans living with serious mental illness. So for anyone in research, I don't have to explain to you the feeling that comes upon me when I read this after having researched this stuff and built these arguments for the past couple of years. I will say that what Insel left the NIMH to do when he left was to work for Google. He was working for their health startup. So I still don't see the vision for what he's really arguing for, and I'll read the book and I'll see. But I suppose it should bring some comfort that someone on a very national stage is making a similar point. But he still made this graph and I'm still angry about it. Okay, that is all I have. I'll stop there. We can have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. You've laid out the history and the rationale and the predicament, I think, very, very clearly. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Yeah, please
thank you all so much.
Yeah. Thank you all. That's really, really helpful.